The pen was in her hand, the papers were on the table, and her husband, the man she had loved for 4 years, the man she had built a home with, the man whose child she was carrying, was sitting across from her, watching, waiting. She signed her name, and he laughed, not loudly, not cruelly, not the kind of laugh that fills a room and leaves a mark. Just a small, quiet, satisfied laugh. The laugh of a man who believes he has already won. What he did not know, what he had never bothered to find out, was who she was. Not her name, not her family, not the quiet, powerful man in Connecticut who answered on the second ring when his daughter called. The man who had shaken Derek's hand at the wedding and said very simply, "Take care of her." Derek had not taken care of her. And now, 8 months pregnant, alone, signing away a marriage that had been a lie, Clara was about to find out exactly how much that laugh was going to cost him. This is the story of a woman who stayed quiet for too long, stood up at exactly the right moment, and discovered something she had been carrying her entire life without knowing it, her own power. The lesson this story carries: the quietest women are often the ones you should never, ever underestimate. If this story speaks to something you have felt, something you have survived or are surviving right now, stay with me. Like this video. Leave a comment. Tell me, have you ever been underestimated by someone who should have known better? Share this with a woman who needs to hear it today, because someone in your life does. And subscribe to this channel, because every week I bring you a story about women who fell down, stood back up, and built something more beautiful than what they lost. This is one of those stories. Let's begin.
The pen scratched across the paper, and then Derek laughed. It was not a loud laugh. It was not the kind of laugh that fills a room. It was small, contained. The kind of laugh a man makes when something he expected to be difficult turns out to be easy. When a door he thought was locked swings open without resistance. When an opponent folds before he even has to push, Clara heard it. She heard every note of it, and she kept her eyes on the page. She signed her name the way she had been signing it for 4 years. Clara M. Calloway. The M stood for Margaret, her grandmother's name, a woman who had survived 3 decades of difficulty and called it her education. Clara set the pen down. She did not look at her husband. She looked at her hands instead, both of them resting flat on the table. One of them still wearing her wedding ring, the other pressed gently against her stomach, against the hard, warm curve of her belly. 8 months along, 8 months of a life she had built with a man who was now laughing. She thought, this is not the way this was supposed to go. But then, had anything gone the way it was supposed to? She picked up her bag. She stood. She nodded once to Frank Holloway, her attorney, who sat across the table with his hands folded and his expression carefully neutral. She walked to the elevator without a word. The doors closed behind her. She looked at her own reflection in the polished metal. She thought, he doesn't know who I am. He never did. 312 days earlier, Clara had been standing in their kitchen on a Tuesday morning, and she had thought, this is it. This is the life. She was 29 years old and 8 weeks pregnant. Derek was making coffee the way he always did, slightly too strong, slightly too sweet, exactly the way she liked it. The house smelled like toast and the particular kind of morning that feels like it belongs only to you. The nursery down the hall was still a guest room, but she had already chosen the paint, a soft, warm green, like new grass in April. You're staring at me, Derek said without turning around. I know, Clara said. He turned then, and he smiled at her, that full, easy smile that had made her trust him from the beginning, the kind of smile that makes you feel chosen, seen, the only person in the room. She smiled back. This is the life, she thought again. She believed it completely. Here's what Clara knew about herself in those early days of her pregnancy. She was 30 years old. She had a master's degree in art history that she had never quite used in the way she had planned. She had a part-time consultancy she genuinely loved, helping private collectors authenticate and place mid-century American paintings. She had good friends. She had a body doing something extraordinary and uncomfortable and miraculous all at once. She had a father she rarely talked about in public. That last part was intentional. Warren Whitfield was not the Bandstas who appeared in newspapers by choice. He preferred to operate at the edges of visibility, behind foundations, behind holding companies, behind names that did not connect back to his directly. His wealth was not the flashy kind. It was the old, quiet kind, the kind that had accumulated across 3 generations and compounded in ways that most people could not fully conceptualize. Clara had grown up with that wealth and had learned early that it complicated everything. People treated you differently when they knew, men especially. So when she moved to Chicago for graduate school, she moved as Clara Whitfield. No explanation of the Whitfield part. No mention of her father's name. Just a woman with good taste and a comfortable life. The source of that comfort, deliberately vague. She met Derek at a gallery opening. He was there with colleagues from the finance firm where he worked. He was charming and funny and curious. He asked her about a painting she was standing near. He actually listened to her answer. He asked a follow-up question that showed he had understood the first answer. She found that remarkable. She still found it remarkable, even now looking back. That a person could seem so genuinely interested and be so thoroughly performing interest. They dated for 2 years. They married quietly, in a garden, with 40 people present. Her father had shaken Derek's hand and said, in that soft, level voice of his, "Take care of her." Derek had said he would. Clara had believed him. The first month of her pregnancy was luminous. That was the only word for it. Everything had a particular quality, like light through water. Warm and slightly unclear at the edges, and beautiful. Derek was attentive. He read pregnancy books, or appeared to. He came to her 8-week appointment and held her hand during the ultrasound. The technician pressed the wand to Clara's stomach, and the room filled with the fast, steady beat of a small heart. Derek's hand tightened around hers. She looked at his face and saw something that looked entirely like wonder. Maybe it was real. She no longer knew. That was one of the things you lost in the end, the ability to trust your own memory of a person. He called his mother that same evening and put her on speakerphone. Donna Calloway's voice went high with excitement at the news. She said, "A baby, Derek. A baby, oh my goodness. Oh, this is wonderful." Everything looked like a dream. That was the trouble with dreams. You could not always feel the edges. Becca Hartley came over that first month on a Wednesday evening. She brought Thai food and strong opinions, which was her standard combination. Becca was Clara's oldest friend. They had met freshman year of college over a shared loathing of their dormitory's communal bathroom and had been honest with each other ever since. Becca was a labor and delivery nurse. She had seen every possible variation of the human experience at its most raw. She had the vocabulary for all of it. She set the food on the counter and looked at Clara's stomach and said, "How are you feeling?" "Wonderful," Clara said. "Genuinely wonderful." Becca tilted her head. "And Derek?" "Wonderful," Clara said again. Becca made a sound. Not quite agreement. Not quite disagreement. Something in between. "What?" Clara said. "Nothing," Becca said. "Tell me about the nursery." Clara talked about the nursery, the soft green paint, the rocking chair she was hoping to have shipped from Connecticut, the mobile she had found at a vintage market that played a French lullaby she had loved as a child. Becca ate her pad thai and listened and smiled. She asked good questions. She was present in the way that good friends are present. But later, much later, Clara would remember that sound Becca had made, that small, careful, not quite agreement sound, when asked about Derek. She would understand what it had meant. The nursery paint went up on a Saturday in early autumn. Derek helped. He rolled the walls while Clara cut in the edges. They laughed about how bad he was at keeping a straight line. The afternoon had that golden, timeless quality of a day you know, even as you are inside it, that you will remember. Clara pressed her palm against the wet paint when they were done, just for a second, just to leave a mark. She did not know why she did it. Something about wanting to be present. Something about wanting to say, I was here. This was real. She would think about that handprint later. She would wonder what it had meant, that she had needed to mark herself into something that was supposed to already belong to her. The first thing that did not quite fit was small, unremarkable, even. It was a Thursday. Clara was 10 weeks pregnant. Derek came home from work at 7:15, kissed her on the cheek, set his bag down. Everything was normal. Everything was fine. Except he smelled different. Not wrong, exactly. Just different. A soap she did not recognize, a fabric softener that was not theirs. She noticed it the way you notice a picture frame that has been moved a quarter inch. Not with certainty, just with a faint, inexplicable sense of wrongness. She did not say anything. She checked her phone instead. Once, twice, 3 times. Lock, unlock, lock, unlock, lock. She did not know what she was looking for. That was the worst part. I'm probably being hormonal, she thought. Everything feels more intense right now. That's just what pregnancy does. Everything seems significant because everything is significant. She believed that. She set her phone down and went to help with dinner. The evening passed quietly. Derek was cheerful and easy and normal. He asked about her day. He told her about a difficult account he was managing. He fell asleep on the couch, watching something on television, and she covered him with a blanket and stood looking at him for a moment. He looked like a person she trusted completely. She told herself, that is what he is. She went to bed. She did not sleep well. October came with cold rain and the smell of leaves turning. Clara was 12 weeks pregnant. The nausea had mostly eased. She had more energy. She had started going to a prenatal yoga class on Tuesday mornings. A studio 2 miles from their house, warm wood floors, the smell of sandalwood. 6 women in that class. Clara was the youngest by 4 years. She liked that. She liked being surrounded by women who had already done hard things. And she had started, very quietly, to wonder. Not about anything specific, just wondering. The name appeared on a Tuesday. Derek had set his phone on the kitchen counter to charge, face up, and a text came through while he was in the shower. Clara was not snooping. She was not even near the counter. She was at the kitchen table with her coffee and a catalog for vintage prints, and she glanced up at the notification sound the way anyone would. The name on the screen was Meredith. She looked away immediately, put her eyes back on the catalog, turned a page. That could be anyone, she thought. A colleague, a client, a friend she hadn't heard about. She believed that. She turned another page, but the name, Meredith. It sat in the back of her mind the way a word sits when you can't quite remember its definition. Present, stubborn, refusing to move. She almost asked him about it. Twice. Once at dinner that same night, when there was a lull in the conversation, the words were right there, lined up and ready. Who is Meredith? She did not say them. The second time was the following Sunday, when Derek said he had to go into the office for a few hours. She stood at the living room window and watched him back out of the driveway. And the thought arrived, fully formed and unasked for. He is not going to the office. She closed the blinds. She told herself she was being irrational. She went to the guest room and spent 3 hours building a board on her laptop. Crib styles, mobile ideas, reading Nook configurations for the corner of the nursery. She lost herself in it completely. Later, she understood that strategy. When the anxiety got too large to look at directly, you found something small and manageable and focused there instead. You made things neat when nothing was neat. You created order at the edges of a life that was quietly coming apart. She said it to her reflection one morning, at the bathroom mirror, 4:30 in the morning, Derek asleep down the hall. "I'm not imagining it," she said quietly. "I'm not. Something is wrong." She said it like she was testing whether it sounded crazy out loud. It did not sound crazy. That was what troubled her. She called her mother that week. Evelyn Whitfield answered on the third ring. They talked about the baby, about the nursery, about whether the rocking chair could be shipped from Connecticut in time. Near the end of the call, Clara said, "Mom, how do you know when something is actually wrong? How do you know the difference between that and just being nervous?" There was a pause. "You already know," Evelyn said. "That's why you're asking." "Mom, I'm not being cryptic. I'm being precise." Her mother's voice was calm and even. When you're nervous, you go looking for evidence. When you know, you go looking for proof to talk yourself out of it. A pause. "Which one are you doing?" Clara did not answer. Her mother let the silence sit for a full 10 seconds. "Call me," Evelyn said. "Whatever you find out, call me first." The prenatal yoga class met Tuesday mornings. One of the women was named Harriet, 41 years old, expecting her third child. She had the kind of ease that came from having done something before and knowing that hard things were survivable. One morning, they were in a resting pose, flat on their sides, the room warm and quiet. And Harriet said, half to herself and half to the air, "My husband thinks I don't notice things. Men always think that. They confuse quietness with unawareness." No one responded. The instructor continued her gentle guidance. But Clara heard those words, quietness and unawareness. She had been very quiet for weeks. That did not mean she was unaware. She was aware of everything. She Googled it at 2 in the morning. She had told herself she would not do this. She had told herself there was nothing to Google. She had told herself, very firmly, for 3 weeks, that she was a pregnant woman whose hormones were making her hypervigilant, and that was a completely normal and documented phenomenon, and she would not spiral into paranoia over a text notification from someone named Meredith. And then at 2 in the morning, with the bedroom dark and Derek breathing steadily beside her, she picked up her phone. "Signs your husband is cheating." 11 million results. She read 4 articles. She made mental check marks next to certain items. She did not finish the 5th. She closed the browser. She deleted the search history. And then she lay in the dark, feeling something complicated. Not shame, exactly. Not guilt. Something more specific than either. The feeling of having done a thing you told yourself you would not do, and discovering that the thing confirmed everything you had told yourself you were imagining. The check marks were not comforting. "I deserve to know the truth," she thought, "even if it breaks me." She lay there until 5 in the morning. Then she got up and made coffee and watched the sun come up over the backyard, and she thought very carefully about what she was going to do. Not yet, she decided. I need more. I need to be certain before I do anything. Because once I do something, everything changes, and there is no changing it back. The second thing that did not fit was not small. Clara was 14 weeks pregnant. A Friday evening in late October, Derek had said he was having dinner with colleagues from the New York office, entertaining clients, an important account. He dressed carefully. He looked good. He kissed her goodbye and told her not to wait up. She did not wait up. She went to bed at 10 and fell into the kind of shallow, unreliable sleep that came with the second trimester. At 11:15, she woke thirsty. She went to the kitchen. On the way back, she passed the chair where Derek always draped his jacket when he came home. She was going to hang it up, that was all. She picked it up. The receipt fell out of the inside pocket. She bent and picked it up off the floor. A restaurant. A name she did not recognize. A date. 2 entrees. A bottle of wine. A good bottle. Dessert for 2. The date on the receipt was October 14th. She stood in the kitchen at 11:20 at night, 8 months from now, the mother of a girl she did not yet know to call Alice. And she looked at that date. October 14th. She had been in the hospital on October 14th. A routine checkup that had turned less routine. A small scare with her blood pressure. 4 hours of monitoring. Derek had come, briefly. He had sat with her for 40 minutes. Then he said he had an urgent call he could not miss. He said he would be right back. He had not come back. She had texted him. Everything is fine. They're keeping me a few more hours just to be safe. No need to rush back. She had been generous. She had been understanding. She had told herself, he is under a lot of pressure. This account he has been managing is genuinely difficult. He is doing his best. He had been at dinner with someone, burgundy and 2 desserts. Clara set the receipt on the counter. She went back to bed. She lay in the dark for 3 hours, not crying, not spiraling, just breathing and thinking and making a decision. Derek came to bed at midnight. He was careful not to wake her. She kept her eyes closed. She was pretending to be asleep to avoid a conversation she was not ready for. She had done that before, in small ways, pretending to sleep when she didn't want to talk about a bad mood. But this was different. This was the first deliberate performance of her marriage. The first time she had looked at her husband through closed eyes. She thought of something Becca had said once at work about a particular kind of patient. The hardest part isn't the pain, Becca had said. It's watching someone refuse to see what's right in front of them. Claire understood that now. The refusal was not stupidity. It was not weakness. It was love. The long, lingering residue of love. The reluctance to destroy something you built, even after you have seen the cracks. She breathed. She waited for morning. November arrived with cold that meant it. Clara was 4 months pregnant. She was showing properly now. The visible, rounded curve that changed the way she moved through the world. Strangers smiled at her in grocery stores. Strangers said how wonderful, and when are you due, and she smiled back and said, March, and felt beneath the smile the particular quiet grief of a woman carrying a joy and a wound at exactly the same time. Not despair, not yet, just grief. The kind that arrives when you understand that something you loved was not what you thought it was. The kind that asks for nowhere to go and no one to blame and nothing but time. She did not confront Derek in November. This was a choice. Deliberate. She needed to understand the shape of what was happening before she could respond to it. She was not being passive. She was being precise. She began to pay attention differently. She paid attention the way she paid attention to artwork. Not at the surface, but at what the surface was built on top of. The underpainting, the structure beneath, the decisions the artist had made and then covered over. The first piece came from his phone. Derek had always been a man who left his phone wherever it landed. Counter, couch, charger, not precious about it. Now he carried it everywhere. He took it to the bathroom. He kept it face down on restaurant tables. He had developed a new habit of reaching for it whenever a notification sounded, regardless of what else was happening. One evening, Clara picked up his phone by accident. She was reaching for her own, grabbed his instead. He was across the kitchen in 3 steps, hand out, a tightness around his eyes that disappeared so fast she almost missed it. "Sorry," she said, holding it out to him. "I thought it was mine." "No worries," he said, bright smile. Easy voice, nothing to see here. But she had seen the tightness, and she knew what it meant. The second piece was the hours. Derek had always worked late occasionally. Finance did that. But in November, occasionally became 3 times a week. Then 4. He texted when he was going to be late. The texts had a careful, pre-composed quality. The same phrases cycling through. Big week, don't wait up. Client dinner running long, heading home soon, save me leftovers. She started writing down the times he actually arrived home, in a small notebook, the kind she used for auction records. Date on the left. Stated reason in the middle. Actual arrival time on the right. The gap between stated time and actual time ranged from 45 minutes to 3 hours. She looked at those gaps. She thought, this could still be work. This could still be the account he is managing. Finance is genuinely like this sometimes. She almost believed it. She sat in the parking garage after her OB appointment for 40 minutes. Engine running, heat on, cars moving past on the level below. She had her hands on the wheel, and she was staring at nothing in particular, and she was thinking about the gaps in her notebook and the receipt from October 14th, and the way he had crossed the kitchen so fast when she touched his phone. She sat there for 40 minutes, then she drove home. She did not say anything that evening, but something had crystallized. She knew. She had known for weeks. She had been going looking for proof to talk herself out of it, and she had not found any. There was nothing left to find except the truth. The third piece arrived in his home office. She was using his printer. Her own had run out of ink. She needed paper. She opened the drawer where he kept it. Under the paper was a folder. Under the folder was an envelope. She was not looking for anything. She never would have found it if she had been. Inside the envelope was a hotel confirmation. 2 nights. A hotel in the city. 2 weeks prior, listed under both names, D. Calloway and M. Slade, Meredith. Clara stood in his office in the gray November light. She held the paper. She read it twice. She read it a third time, slowly, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something more innocent on the 4th reading. They did not. She placed the confirmation back in the envelope. She placed the envelope back under the folder. She put the folder back under the paper. She took what she needed from the printer, and she went back to the kitchen, and she stood at the sink and looked out at the backyard for a long time. She thought, I already knew. I've known for weeks. I just kept choosing not to know. Her mother's voice, when you know, you go looking for proof to talk yourself out of it. She had been looking for 2 months. She had not found a single thing to talk herself out of. She called Becca that evening, not to tell her, not yet. She just called. When Becca picked up and said, Hey, you, how are you doing? Clara opened her mouth to say fine the way she always said fine. And instead she said nothing. A full minute of silence. Becca let it sit. She waited through all of it. She was good at silence. Her job had taught her that. She waited, and she did not ask Clara to speak. Finally, Clara said, I think I need to see you. Come over, Becca said immediately. I'll have food, and I will listen to literally anything you need to say. I will not make a single sound that is in any way an I told you so sound. That is my promise. Clara almost laughed. Almost. Give me an hour, she said. She spread the evidence on Becca's kitchen table, the hotel confirmation, a photograph she had taken on her phone of the restaurant receipt, the pages from her notebook with the times and the gaps. 3 months of documentation. Becca looked at all of it without speaking. Then she said, Clara. I know, Clara said. I need you to hear me say it. I know, Clara said again. I've known. I've known for weeks. I kept telling myself that knowing and having proof were different things. They are different things, Becca said. But you have both now. Yes? Becca reached across the table and took Clara's hand. Okay, she said. What do you want to do? What do you want to do? Not what are you going to do? A question about desire, about agency, about what Clara needed, rather than what the situation required. She was grateful for that. She would be grateful for it for years. I need a lawyer, Clara said. I know one. Family law. Very good. He represented a colleague of mine, and she came out of it significantly better than she went in. Becca paused. His name is Frank Holloway. Give me his number, Clara said. I'll call when I'm ready. They sat at the table for another hour, not talking much, just sitting. Becca made tea. Clara wrapped both hands around the mug and felt its warmth and thought about the word ready and wondered when it would arrive. There was a moment near the end of that evening when Clara looked at the evidence arranged on Becca's table. The accumulated documentation of months of her life spent living alongside a lie. I just want to understand one thing, she said quietly. Was any of it real? The way he looked at me that morning in the kitchen? The way he came to the ultrasound? She paused. Was that anything? Becca was quiet for a moment. I think, Becca said carefully, that might be the question you never get a full answer to. Clara let that settle. That's the thing, isn't it? She said. You can know someone for years, sleep beside them, build things, make a life, and you still can't fully see inside them. No, Becca said. You can't. A long silence. Honey, Becca said. I've been biting my tongue for 2 years. Clara looked at her. He looked at you like you were a prize, Becca said. Not like you were a person. I saw it, and I never said it because I wasn't certain, and you were happy, and I didn't want to be that person, but I saw it. Clara looked back at the table. I deserve to know the truth, she said, even if it breaks me. Yes, Becca said. You do. You always did. December, the shortest days of the year, the light arriving late and leaving early, as if it had somewhere more important to be. Clara was 6 months pregnant. The baby moved regularly now, long, rolling movements that made Clara gasp and then smile. She had started talking to her. She knew it was a girl. She had known since the 20-week scan, which she had attended alone because Derek had a meeting he could not reschedule. She had lain on the table in the dim room and heard the technician say, "It's a girl." She had thought, of course it's a girl. We are going to be okay. The two of us, we are going to be exactly okay. She held that thought like a stone in her pocket, smooth and solid, something to touch when everything else felt uncertain. She retained Frank Holloway on a Wednesday morning in early December. His office was on the 14th floor of a building downtown, quiet, tasteful. The kind of restraint that signals competence rather than lack of imagination. He was a man in his early 50s with very good shoes, and the kind of stillness that comes from having listened to a great deal of pain over many years. He listened to everything Clara told him without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "This is a strong position. Depending on the full circumstances, you may be entitled to a significant settlement, particularly given the pregnancy." I'm not primarily interested in destroying him financially, Clara said. I want clarity. I want to protect my child. I want to understand my options. Frank nodded. Understood. Let's talk about documentation. I also want to know how long this has been going on, Clara said. Accurately. Can that be established? With the right resources, yes, Frank said. 2 to 3 weeks. Do it, she said. She stood to leave. Then she turned back. Frank, whatever you find out, I want to know all of it. Not the version that's gentler, all of it. He looked at her steadily. Understood, he said again. She continued her life. She went to yoga. She attended her OB appointments, all normal, all progressing well. The baby growing steadily and magnificently. She made dinner. She had conversations. She watched Derek across the dinner table, and she performed the ordinary architecture of a marriage with the same care she had always given it, because she had decided, not yet. She would act when the time was right. She would not be reactive. She would not give him the advantage of chaos. She would not do anything that looked like panic. She was learning something about herself in this period. She was learning that her quietness had never been weakness. It had always been patience. She called her father on a Tuesday evening in mid-December. Her parents were in Connecticut. He answered on the second ring. He always answered for Clara on the second ring. "There you are," Warren Whitfield said. His voice was exactly as she remembered it from childhood. Low and measured, warm in a way that did not advertise itself. "Hi, Dad. How are you feeling? How's the baby?" "Both good." A pause. "Dad, I need to tell you something." There was a silence. The particular kind of silence her father produced when he was paying complete and total attention. "Tell me," he said. She told him. Not everything, not yet. The outline, the facts, what she knew and what she had confirmed and what she was doing about it. Her father listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "Are you safe? Yes? Is the baby safe? Yes. Are you handling it the right way?" "I think so." A pause. Then his voice shifted. Not warmer exactly, more present. "I want you to know something. Whatever you need, whatever it costs, whatever kind of help you ask for, I am here. Do you understand that?" Something loosened in her chest. Something she had not realized she had been holding. "I know, Dad," she said. "Thank you." After she hung up, she sat with the phone in her hands. She had not told her father Derek's full name. She had not told him the name of Derek's firm. Warren Whitfield was a thorough man. She suspected none of those details would remain unknown to him for long, but he would wait. He would wait until she asked. That was who her father was. The worst piece of evidence was not the hotel confirmation. It was not the name Meredith on the screen. It was not even the receipt from October 14th, the night she had been in the hospital alone. The worst piece came from the credit card statements. She had been going through 3 months of statements, not for evidence, but for the nursery budget. She had printed them and spread them on the kitchen table. She had a yellow highlighter. She was looking for contractor charges, furniture deposits, paint costs. The charges were there in plain language. Restaurants she had never been to, a jewelry store, a charge for $340 in November, on a day when Derek had given her nothing. Hotel charges, a spa booking, flowers, 4 separate flower deliveries, over 3 months. She added the total, $6,280 in 3 months, on a person who was not his wife. She sat with that number for a very long time. Then she got up. She went to the nursery and she reorganized the entire room at midnight. She moved the crib 2 inches. She refolded every tiny onesie in the drawer. She arranged the books on the small shelf by color, and then by size, and then by color again. She made everything perfect and neat and ordered. She worked in complete silence for 2 hours, and when she was done, she sat on the floor with her back against the crib and looked at the soft green walls in the dark. "He does not get to make me small," she said out loud, to no one. Not anymore. She meant it. She felt it settle into her bones. Not anger, not tears, something harder and cleaner than either, determination. January arrived. Frank Holloway called on the 15th. "The documentation is ready," he said. and the investigator's report is complete. She went to his office that afternoon. She sat across from his desk. He opened a manila folder and placed it in front of her. She read it. 7 months. The affair had been ongoing for 7 months. Meredith Slade worked in corporate sales at a competing firm. She was 27 years old. She had met Derek at a conference in April. A physical card tracked through a florist had been sent to Derek for his birthday in June. She had not known, the investigator believed, that Derek was married. Not at the beginning. Clara sat with that, not to excuse anything, not to redirect her anger, just to understand the full shape of what had happened, because understanding the full shape was how she had always approached difficult things. You did not look away from the parts that complicated the clean narrative. You looked at all of it. One more thing, Frank said carefully. She looked up. The accounts, he said. He placed a second set of documents on the desk. He has been moving money out of your joint accounts. Small amounts, irregular timing, but accumulating, he paused. Over the past 18 months, the total is significant. Clara looked at the number at the bottom of the page. She was very still for a moment. That constitutes financial fraud within a marriage, Frank said quietly. Yes, Clara said. I imagine it does. She left his office 40 minutes later. She stood on the sidewalk in the January cold, and she breathed in the sharp air, and she thought, now I'm ready. She chose a Saturday morning, the 3rd week of January. Derek was home, in the living room, reading, coffee on the side table, the ordinary, comfortable pose of a man with a clean conscience, or a man who had perfected the performance of one. Clara came in and sat in the chair across from him. She said, Derek, I need to talk to you. Something in her voice made him look up. Not the words, not even the tone exactly. Something underneath the tone. An absence of the softness he had come to expect from her. He put the book down. Okay, he said. She put the credit card statements on the coffee table. She placed the hotel confirmation beside them. She watched his face. Later, she would remember this in precise detail. The way the color in his face changed. Not immediately, in stages. Like a photograph in a developing tray. The initial expression of confusion, performed carefully. The moment of recognition, swiftly covered. The decision, made in less than 2 seconds, about which way to go. He went for denial. Clara, where did you find... I can explain. I'm not asking you to explain, she said. Her voice was quiet, steady, so far below anger that it seemed to unsettle him more than anger would have. I want you to confirm what I already know, she said. That's all. I don't need a story. I don't need details. I just want you to tell me the truth, straight. A silence. He looked at the statements. He looked at the hotel confirmation. He looked at her hands, both of them resting flat on her knees, perfectly still. Clara, ufuma up. Her name is Meredith Slade, Clara said. You have been seeing her for 7 months. You spent over $6,000 on her in the last quarter alone. You took her to the Brentmore Hotel in November for 2 nights. You gave her jewelry. She paused. Is any of that incorrect? He looked at his hands. No, he said. It's not incorrect. She noticed the word. Incorrect. Not wrong. Not yes, you're right. Incorrect. As if she had read him a financial report and he was confirming the figures. Okay, she said. She stood. I've retained an attorney, she said. His name is Frank Holloway. You'll be hearing from him. She walked to the bedroom. She closed the door. She sat on the edge of the bed. Anger had frozen into determination. That was all she felt. A cold, clear, forward-moving purpose. No hysteria, no tears. Those would come later. She knew that. But not now. Not in front of him. She put her hand on her stomach. We are going to be okay, she thought. Both of us. He knocked 20 minutes later. Clara, Can we talk? Please. She opened the door. He was standing in the hall, genuinely distressed, or performing distress with enough skill that she could no longer distinguish between the two. She tried to feel something about that. She found that she could not. I made a mistake, he said. I know that. Derek, she said, please stop. Clara, I love you. I love the baby. I want to fix this. She looked at him. She studied his face the way she had spent years studying objects, looking for what was real beneath the surface. You don't want to fix anything, she said. You want to avoid consequences. There is a difference between loving someone and wanting to keep what they provide. I think you have confused those two things for a very long time. She stepped back. My attorney will be in touch, she said, and she closed the door. He moved out within the week. Not willingly. He negotiated. He proposed alternatives. Counseling. A trial separation. A cooling-off period. He offered these things with the energy of a man who had not yet understood that negotiation requires both parties to be uncertain. Clara was not uncertain. She was methodical. Frank Holloway was precise and thorough and very good at his work. By the time the divorce papers were drafted, he had a complete accounting of every joint asset, every hidden transfer, every account that had been quietly restructured over the past 18 months. The number at the bottom of that final accounting was not a small one. Frank said, "This constitutes financial fraud within a marriage. His legal exposure is significant." Clara said, "I understand." Frank said, "This is a strong position." Clara said, "I know." Derek came to the house one more time before the papers were served. She had not invited him. He knocked, and she opened the door because she was a person who answered doors, and he stood on the porch in his good coat. "I just want to talk," he said. "You can talk to my attorney," she said. "Clara." Derek. Level. Absolute. "Go home." He looked at her belly. Then something happened in his face that she would never entirely forget. He straightened up. He adjusted his expression. And he said, with a casual certainty that moved through her like cold water, "The baby doesn't change the math, Clara. My attorney says you're not entitled to—" "Go home," she said. He went. She closed the door. She stood in the hallway. The baby doesn't change the math. Not grief, not guilt, not the recognition that he had destroyed something real. Math. She thought of her father's voice. "I would very much like to make a phone call." "Not yet," she had said. "Not yet." But the yet was running out. The papers were served on a Tuesday. Frank called that afternoon to confirm. Derek's attorney advised him to sign without delay. The financial fraud documentation made his position precarious. Prolonging the process would only compound the exposure. He agreed to sign at Frank's office. 1 week later, Clara was present for her portion. She came in. She sat down. Frank placed the papers in front of her. He handed her a pen. She signed her name, Clara M. Calloway. She thought of her grandmother, Margaret, a woman who had called difficulty her education. "This is mine," she thought. "This is my education beginning." She set down the pen, and then she heard it. From across the table, from the man who had arrived late and barely looked at her and treated this entire proceeding like a transaction he was impatient to finish. A laugh, small, brief. The laugh of a man who expected difficulty and found ease. The laugh of a man who believed he had gotten away with something. Clara looked up. Derek met her eyes for 1 second, then he looked away. She picked up her bag. She stood up. She nodded to Frank. She walked to the elevator. She thought, riding down alone, watching her own reflection in the polished doors, "He doesn't know my name, not my real name, not what it means. He never did." She had not told Derek her father's name. In 4 years of marriage, not once. She had said, "My father is a businessman, private equity, Very private. Lives in Connecticut with my mother. He's well. That was all. Derek had asked once, early on, if he could meet him. Clara had said, when the time is right. The time had never arrived. Her father had met Derek at the wedding. He had shaken his hand. He had said, take care of her. He had made his assessment in that moment. Warren Whitfield was very good at assessments. He had simply waited, as was his nature, for the situation to declare itself. She went into labor 4 days after signing the divorce papers. 38 weeks and 3 days. Technically early, but not concerning. Becca had told her this could happen. First babies sometimes decided on their own schedule. The body had its own logic. The contractions started at 2 in the morning. She lay in the dark and breathed through the first 3. She timed them on her phone. 7 minutes apart, then 6. She got up and called Becca. 6 minutes apart, she said, starting to pick up. I'm on my way, Becca said. No hesitation, no questions. Just, I'm on my way. That was Becca. That was what 30 years of friendship looked like in practice. There had been weather that week. Not severe by Midwestern standards, but enough. Enough to slow everything down. Enough to make the roads careful and dark and necessary. When Becca arrived, 40 minutes later, she came in the door and looked at Clara and said, we need to go now. Clara had her bag ready. She had packed it 3 weeks ago. She had packed it and checked it twice and repacked it once at 2 in the morning during the nursery reorganization phase. They went. Clara sat in the passenger seat and breathed through contractions that were coming faster. The world outside was dark and cold, and the streetlights smeared in the wet. Everything reduced to essentials. The warmth of the car, Becca's presence, the waves arriving and passing. You're doing great, Becca said. I know, Clara said. Then, after a long pause, Becca, yeah. I'm not afraid. Becca glanced sideways at her. I've been afraid for months, Clara said. Of what I would find out, of what it would mean, of doing this alone. She breathed through a contraction, counted. But right now in this car, on these roads, at 2 in the morning, I am not afraid of any of it. Becca put her hand briefly on Clara's. Good, she said. Stay there. The hospital was bright and loud and cold in the particular way hospitals are cold. Dr. Ann Prescott was already there. She was a calm woman, precise and steady, who had seen everything and was rattled by nothing. She examined Clara and said, You're moving quickly. Let's get you settled. The next several hours were the most purely physical hours of Clara's life. Pain she had been told about and still had no adequate prior reference for. Her body doing something enormous and ancient and entirely without her permission. Becca on one side, Dr. Prescott and the nurses managing what needed to be managed. At one point, deep in transition, Clara gripped the rail of the bed and said through her teeth, not loudly, but with absolute certainty, I can do this. I have always been able to do this. She said it like a fact she was reminding herself of, like something she had always known but temporarily mislaid. Becca heard it and did not say anything. She just held Clara's hand tighter. The baby arrived at 5:48 in the morning. 6 pounds, 9 ounces, a voice that filled the room immediately and without apology. Clara lay in the too bright room and listened to her daughter announce herself to the world. And something shifted in her chest, something that moved so completely and absolutely that she could not remember, for a moment, what it had felt like before. Here she is, Dr. Prescott said, and placed her there. Her daughter. Small and perfect and furious at the indignity of arrival, eyes squinted against the light, hands curled into small, outraged fists. Already a person, already entirely specific. Clara held her. She looked at her daughter's face, the particular, unrepeatable face of the child she had made, and she said, very quietly, "Hi. I know. It's a lot. I know." Her daughter stopped crying almost immediately, as if she recognized the voice, as if the voice meant, "You're safe. You're with me. We're okay." From the corner, Becca made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob. Something in between. She called her mother first. Evelyn Whitfield answered on the second ring. Clara said, "Mom, she's here. She's perfect. Her name is Alice." Her mother's voice went to pieces, in the best possible way, in the way of a woman who had been waiting and hoping and carrying her own worry for months, and was now finally putting it down. Alice Margaret Whitfield, not Calloway. She had thought about this in the weeks since the papers were signed. She had thought about it carefully. The name that went on the birth certificate, the name her daughter would carry. Alice Margaret Whitfield, her grandmother's name, her family's name, her name, not his. She called her father second. Warren Whitfield answered immediately. "She's here," Clara said. "Alice, 6 pounds 9 ounces. She's perfect, Dad." She heard him breathe. Just breathe. A slow, full breath. The breath of a man who has been holding something and is now, carefully, releasing it. "Clara," he said. "I know," she said. "Can I come?" "Yes," she said. "Come." He arrived 7 hours later. Alone, he had asked Evelyn to come the following day. He understood, without needing to be told, that Clara needed space before she needed company. He came into the room and stood at the door for a moment. Clara looked at her father, this quiet, powerful, private man who loved her with a fierceness he had spent 62 years finding ways to express without saying so directly. She held Alice up slightly. "Dad," she said, "meet Alice." Warren Whitfield came to the bedside. He looked at his granddaughter for a long time. Then he sat in the chair beside the bed and took Clara's free hand. He said nothing. They sat like that in the quiet hospital room, the morning coming in through the window, the city beginning to wake up outside. "He laughed," Clara said eventually. "When I signed the papers, he laughed." Her father looked at her. "He doesn't know who you are," Clara said. "I never told him." Her father nodded. Once, slowly. Then he said, "Would you like him to find out?" Clara looked at Alice, at her sleeping face, at the life that was ahead of them. "Yes," she said quietly. "I think I would." She moved out of the house 2 weeks after Alice was born. Not because she had to. Frank had made clear that she was entitled to the house. The asset distribution, in light of the financial fraud, was significantly in her favor. But she did not want the house. She did not want the nursery with its soft green walls that she had painted with a man who was busy spending $6,000 on someone else. She did not want the kitchen where the receipt had fallen from his jacket. She did not want the life-shaped container of a life that had not been real. She found an apartment on a Tuesday, 3rd floor, high ceilings, south-facing windows that let in light that had intention to it. A second bedroom, just the right size. She painted it the same soft green, not to recreate something, because the color was good and the color had nothing to do with him and had only ever been hers. She pressed her palm against the freshly painted wall. "I was here," she thought. "This is real. This is mine." Her first month with Alice was the most exhausted she had ever been, and some of the most fully alive hours she had ever lived, running alongside each other, inseparable. She did not sleep. No one with a newborn slept. She fed and changed and rocked and looked at this specific small person with a quality of attention she had never directed at anything before. Alice had opinions, already. Strong ones, communicated clearly through an extensive vocabulary of expressions that seemed, frankly, advanced. She disliked being cold. She loved being held. She had, and Clara was not being biased, an exceptional quality of alertness. She looked at things. She paid attention. She'll be all right, Clara thought, watching Alice study the pattern of morning light on the ceiling. She is already paying attention. Becca came over constantly. This was both selfless and self-interested. Becca had fallen into what she referred to as a purely professional admiration of Alice. I work in labor and delivery, she said. I simply appreciate a well-executed newborn. She brought food. She held Alice so Clara could shower. She showed up without announcing herself, and without requiring acknowledgement, and without asking for anything. She was present in the way that matters, not with drama or fanfare, just consistently, reliably, there. One evening, Becca put Alice down in the bassinet and came into the kitchen where Claire was making tea. She said, I know this isn't the moment, but I want to say something. Say it, Clara said. You're going to be okay. Not just survive okay, genuinely okay. A pause. I want you to know I believe that. Clara handed her the tea. I know, she said, and she meant it. It was not a performance of confidence. It was an actual thing she knew. Her parents stayed for 2 weeks. Her mother arrived the day after Warren, efficient and warm and quietly organizing everything within reach. She stocked the kitchen. She learned Alice's schedule with extraordinary speed. She and Clara sat up, sometimes after the late feed, at the kitchen table in the small hours, talking the way they had not talked in years, about the early years of her parents' marriage, about what her mother had navigated and survived and grown through, about what it meant to start over when starting over had not been the plan. The first year is the strange year, Evelyn said one night. You don't know who you are yet in the new life. You're still partially in the old one. Does it get clearer? Clara asked. Much. You start to recognize yourself again, just a different version. Clara thought about the paintings she spent her professional life looking at, the underpainting, the layer beneath, the structure that supported everything visible. A different version, not unrecognizable, not a stranger, just different. She could work with different. She baked her mother's banana bread on a Sunday morning in March. Alice was asleep. The apartment was warm. The smell of it filled every room. Butter and overripe banana and a particular vanilla she had had to find in 3 different stores before she found the right one. The smell of her grandmother's kitchen, the smell of every good Sunday morning of her childhood. There was a knock at the door. She opened it to find her neighbor from across the hall standing there, a woman in her 60s named Ruth Albright, whom Clara had met exactly once in the elevator 3 weeks prior. Ruth was a retired professor of literature, recently widowed, with sharp eyes and excellent posture and a quality of stillness that Clara recognized as the particular stillness of a person who has done a lot of reading. Ruth stood in the doorway looking delighted. I'm sorry to bother you, Ruth said, but something in this building smells extraordinary, and I've been trying to identify which apartment for 20 minutes. Clara laughed, a real laugh, full and unperformed, and she realized, the first one in weeks. The genuine kind that comes from somewhere below your ribs. Come in, she said. I'll cut you a slice. Ruth became unexpectedly a presence. She checked in, not intrusively, not with advice, not in a way that required anything from Clara. She appeared occasionally with food and said things like, I made too much. She sat with Alice sometimes, so Clara could come take a walk, or make a phone call, or simply stand alone in the south-facing light of her own kitchen for 10 minutes. She did not offer opinions she had not been asked for. She had, she told Clara once, a strict personal policy against unsolicited guidance. I never intrude, Ruth said. I only appear with food. That is the best possible policy, Clara said. I have refined it over decades, Ruth said, entirely seriously. Starting over was exactly what Becca had promised it would be. Possible. Not easy. Not without its long, quiet aches. Evenings when the apartment felt too still. Mornings when she saw a couple with a stroller and felt the particular, specific sting of what might have been if things had been different. Those moments came. She did not fight them. She let them pass the way weather passes, completely and without permanent damage. She said to herself, one morning at the bathroom mirror, Alice balanced on her hip. Starting over is not failure. Starting over is the bravest thing I have ever done. She believed it. She was building the belief the way you build anything, gradually, with repetition, with evidence. The evidence was accumulating. Every day was evidence. Warren Whitfield made his calls in March. Clara did not ask him to report back on the precise content. She trusted her father's judgment. She trusted that he understood exactly what she would and would not want done, because he had always understood that about her, even when she was too young to understand it about herself. What she understood was this: her father had information about Derek Calloway's professional conduct, specific information, carefully documented, about certain financial practices at Derek's firm. Warren Whitfield had not manufactured this information. He had simply paid attention, as was his nature, in the weeks since Clara had first called him. He made 2 calls. The first was to a contact at the SEC. The second was to the chairman of Derek's firm. He made neither call with threats. He made neither call with demands. He simply shared information. Information that was accurate and documented, and that had, as accurate and documented information tends to do, significant consequences. Frank Holloway called Clara on a Wednesday. I need to update you on some developments, Frank said, regarding Derek's firm. What kind of developments? Clara said. The kind that have resulted in him being placed on administrative leave while an internal investigation is conducted. A pause. It's likely, in the medium term, to result in his departure from that position, possibly more. Clara sat with this. Frank, she said, this isn't something I arranged. I know, he said. I want to be clear about that. You are clear, Frank said. But Clara, the information that surfaced was real. Whatever the mechanism that brought it forward, what it revealed was real. A pause. That matters. That's the distinction. She thought about the credit card statements, the transferred accounts. The baby doesn't change the math, he had said to her on her own porch. She thought about a man who had spent 4 years calculating variables and outcomes and had not once included, in any of those calculations, the name on his wife's birth certificate. Yes, she said, I suppose it does. Meredith Slade called Frank Holloway's office the same week. This was unexpected. Meredith had apparently received, through channels Clara did not inquire about, a copy of the investigator's report. She had learned the full extent of what Derek had told her and had not told her. She had learned that she had been, in his version of events, a useful piece of a calculation she had not known she was participating in. She wanted to speak to Clara's attorney. She wanted to provide, of her own volition, a statement. Frank relayed this to Clara. Do you want me to take the meeting? He asked. What do you know about her? Clara said. She genuinely did not know he was married when it began, Frank said. She found out around month 4, when she found a photograph of you both on his phone. A pause. He told her you were already separated, that the divorce was imminent. Clara closed her eyes. She's angry, Frank said. Differently than you, but angry. She was lied to, Clara said. Yes. Tell her, tell her I don't have anything against her. Clara paused. If she wants to provide a statement, that's her choice. She doesn't owe me anything. A silence on Frank's end. You're a remarkable person, Clara, he said quietly. I've had an educational year, she said. She told Becca about Meredith over lunch the following week. Becca was quiet for a full minute. You feel sorry for her, Becca said. A little, Clara said. She was a 27-year-old who met a man she liked and was systematically lied to. That's not a villain. That's a person who was deceived. She paused. He is the person who deceived both of us. Most people would still be angry at her, Becca said. Most people would, Clara agreed. It's simpler. Becca looked at her across the table. When did you become this person? Clara smiled. I think she was always there, she said. I was just too busy being someone's good wife to pay attention to her. She went back to work in April. Gently. Part-time, a consulting call here, an authentication project there, a collector in San Francisco trying to verify a diabicorn that had a questionable provenance. It felt good. It felt like reclaiming something that had been hers all along. Her eye was still sharp. Her knowledge was intact. The year had been hard, but it had not taken that from her. The things she knew and the ways she saw were still exactly where she had left them. One afternoon, on a call with a gallery director named Pamela, who had recently taken over a mid-sized space in New York, Pamela said, at the end of their professional conversation, "Can I say something off-topic?" "Sure," Clara said. "I've been working with you for 2 months, and I need to say this," Pamela said. "You have the best eye I have encountered in this business. Not flattery. I've worked with a great deal of consultants. You see things that other people miss." Clara was quiet for a moment. She thought of the year she had spent looking carefully at the underpainting of her own life, at what was real beneath the surface, at what any structure was actually built on. "Thank you," she said. "I've had a lot of practice." Her brother James called in late April. James Whitfield was 34 years old, 4 years older than Clara. He worked with their father. He had their father's patience and their mother's directness, which was a combination that Clara had always found both useful and occasionally exhausting. "So," James said, "Derek Calloway. I imagine Dad told you." "Dad tells me most things." A pause. "He's been suspended. The internal investigation is pointing toward termination. The SEC inquiry is ongoing." Another pause. "He's not facing criminal charges at this point, but he's done professionally. That market is closed to him." Clara was quiet. "He found out, by the way," James said, "whose daughter you are." His attorney apparently looked up the Whitfield name in the context of the settlement documents and found Dad. A pause. "I imagine that was a significant moment for him." Clara sat with her daughter asleep in her arms, and looked out the window at the April afternoon. She thought about the laugh, small, brief. The laugh of a man who thought he had already won. She thought, he knows now. He knows what that laugh cost him. She felt something. Not triumph. Not the hot satisfaction of revenge. Something quieter than that. Something that felt like completion. Like the end of a very long sentence. "Good," she said. "I hope he understands what he threw away." "I don't think he does yet," James said. "I think he's still in the stage where everything is someone else's fault." "He'll get there," Clara said. "Or he won't. Either way, it's no longer my concern." Alice was 3 months old. She had opinions now, fully formed and clearly expressed. She communicated displeasure with a specificity that Clara found both challenging and deeply impressive. She had begun making sounds that had the rhythm of language without the content, practicing, working up to it, approaching the whole project of speaking with the methodical intent of a person who intended to have things to say. "She looks at things the way you look at things," Becca had said once. Clara thought about that. She hoped it was true. The settlement was finalized in May. Frank called with the numbers. They were significant, not because of her father's influence, though Frank was precise about this. The financial fraud documentation had established a clear case. The transferred accounts, the credit card charges, 18 months of deliberate concealment. The numbers were significant. Clara sat with them for a full day. Then she set up a trust in Alice's name. Then she made a donation to a domestic violence organization whose work she had come to understand over the course of this year was more necessary and more underfunded than most people knew. Then she went back to work. She took Alice to the park on a Friday afternoon in May. The park was a 10-minute walk from the apartment. It had a long path bordered by old elms that were fully in leaf now, after the bare months. Clara walked slowly, Alice in the stroller, the city doing its Friday afternoon things around them. She sat on a bench. She thought about the year, all of it. The summer that had felt too perfect, the autumn of nameless dread, the slow winter of revelation. The night she drove through the sleet to a hospital and discovered, in the most direct possible way, that she was more capable than she had known. The spring of rebuilding, the apartment with the south-facing light, Ruth with her soup, Becca with her sparkling water and her 2 years of bitten tongue. Her father's voice. "I would very much like to make a phone call." The laugh. She thought, "I would not undo any of it. Not the pain, not the midnight hours in the nursery, refolding things for the 3rd time, not the parking garage, engine running, not even the laugh. She would not undo it because it had brought her here, to this bench, this afternoon, this specific, ordinary, irreplaceable life, to Alice, and to herself, the version of herself she was now, the one who saw things, the one who did not look away. She met Thomas Greer on a Thursday morning. Not dramatically, not memorably even, in the moment. She was at the coffee shop 2 blocks from her apartment, Alice in the carrier, awake and examining the middle distance with her characteristic focus. Clara was waiting for her order, standing near the window, when a man a few feet away said, with the careful restraint of a person who is not sure a compliment will be welcome, "She has a wonderful quality of attention." Clara looked over. He was looking at Alice, not at Clara, at Alice, with the same quality of genuine interest he had apparently identified in Alice herself. "She does," Clara said. "How old?" he asked. 3 months? He nodded. "You can already tell at that age. The ones who are really paying attention." She looked at him. He was around her age, calm face, the kind of hands that suggested work. He was holding a coffee and a rolled-up set of drawings. "I'm Thomas," he said. "Clara," she said. Her order was called. She picked it up. They nodded to each other. She left. That was it. She saw him again the following Tuesday. Same coffee shop. He was at a corner table with his drawings spread out and a cup going cold beside him. He looked up when she came in and said, "The attention, baby." "The very same," Clara said. She got her coffee. On the way out, she stopped at his table for a moment. She looked at the drawings. Her eye pulled toward them automatically. "Those are interesting," she said. "I'm an architect," he said. "Residential mostly. There's a house in the neighborhood I've been working on for a year that has a structural problem I cannot solve." He paused. "I keep drawing the same solution, and it keeps being wrong." "What's the problem?" He told her. She listened. She asked 2 questions. He looked at her with some surprise. "Do you work in architecture?" he asked. "Art history," she said. "But structure is structure." He smiled. A real smile, the kind that reaches before it arrives. Same time next week? He said. Probably, she said. They talked at the coffee shop through May and into June about architecture and art and how the two disciplines were more similar than most people acknowledged. Both were concerned, at the core, with how something was built, what it was built on, whether the foundation was honest. He was funny. He was careful. He was not a person who performed things. She noticed that early. The absence of performance. He said what he thought, and he meant it, and he did not require her to read between lines. He asked her once, with genuine curiosity, what was the hardest part of the last year. She thought about it. Admitting I already knew, she said, long before I let myself know. The hardest part was the time between knowing and admitting. He nodded slowly. I think that's true of most difficult things, he said. Yes, she said. I've come to think so too. They sat with that for a moment. Alice between them, in the carrier, asleep for once, her face peaceful. What are you reading? He asked, and the conversation continued. She sat on the park bench in September. The same bench, the same park. Alice in the stroller now, bigger, watching the world with her alert and particular gaze. The tree above the bench had gone from the tentative green of April to the full certainty of late summer, just beginning its shift toward autumn. Claire looked at her daughter. She thought about the year, the whole arc of it, beginning to end. She had been 29 years old, standing in a kitchen, thinking, this is the life. She had been right and wrong at exactly the same time. It was the life, just not that life. The right life had looked nothing like the one she had planned. She thought about the things the year had given her, Alice and herself, a clarity she would not have found any other way. Ruth with her literature and her soup, Becca with her 2 years of careful silence and her immediate unconditional presence, her parents, her grandmother's name, living now in her daughter, an eye that saw what was real beneath surfaces, a life that was specifically, exactly, entirely hers. She looked at her own hands, both of them resting on the stroller handle, no wedding ring, that had come off 6 months ago, placed in a small box in the back of a drawer, to be addressed at some point, perhaps melted down into something else, perhaps given to Alice someday with the story of it. Not a story of bitterness, a story of knowing oneself, she thought. I am exactly where I am supposed to be. She thought I always was. I just couldn't see it yet. She called her father that evening. He answered on the second ring. How's my granddaughter? He said. Perfect, Clara said. As always. A pause. Dad, I want to say something. Say it. Thank you for waiting, for letting me handle it myself first, for only doing what you did when I asked. She paused. And for doing it when I asked. Her father was quiet for a moment. I have never been more proud of you, he said, than I was this year, and that covers a great deal of ground. The tears came. Not desperate ones, not broken ones, the kind that come when something is truly over and genuinely okay. The kind that feel like relief rather than grief. I know, Dad, she said. Thank you. She wrote in her journal that night. She had started keeping one in February, in the early sleepless weeks with Alice. Short entries, fragments, evidence of what was real. She wrote, here is what I know now that I did not know 1 year ago. Quietness is not the same as unawareness. Patience is not the same as passivity. Being careful is not the same as being afraid. And love, real love, the kind worth building a life around, does not laugh when you are at your lowest. It comes when called. It sits beside you in the dark without needing to say anything. It does not calculate. It does not keep score. It does not need to win. I am 30 years old. I have a daughter named Alice Margaret, who has her great-grandmother's name and her mother's quality of attention. I have a life that is genuinely, specifically mine, not inherited, not performed, mine. I have an eye that sees what is real beneath the surface, and I have learned, this year, the hardest and most useful thing I have ever learned. The prison door was unlocked the whole time. I was the only one holding it closed. 3 things happened in August. They came in different places at different times, involving different people. Clara did not learn about all of them at once. They arrived gradually, the way seasons arrive, not as a single event, but as an accumulation. A series of small weights added to one side of a scale until the balance shifts and everything settles into a new position. The first thing. Derek Calloway was formally terminated from his position in mid-August. The investigation had taken 4 months. The findings were specific and documented and significant. The termination was uncontested. His attorney, his third by this point, advised him that cooperation was his best remaining option. He was not facing criminal charges. This was a matter of the complexity of financial law and the priorities of the relevant bodies, rather than any genuine ambiguity about what had occurred. But he had lost his position, his standing, his professional network, the carefully constructed identity of a successful man in a good firm. The architecture had come down. Donna Calloway called Clara the week it was announced. Clara answered because she was curious. Donna's voice was different, smaller. The quality of a woman who has had to revise a significant number of her prior beliefs in a short period of time. I wanted to say, Donna said, that I didn't know about the money. I didn't know about that part. Clara said, very gently, Donna, what part did you know about? A long silence. I knew about the girl, Donna said finally. He told me in November. I told him to end it. I told him it was wrong, especially with the baby coming. I should have told you, or made him tell you. I didn't, and I'm sorry. I know, Clara said. She meant it. She was not a person who found comfort in extending bitterness to those who were genuinely sorry. Donna was not an ally. She had made the wrong choice because she loved her son more than she loved doing what was right. That was human. That was comprehensible. It did not excuse it. But it made it something Clara could understand without needing to carry. Take care of yourself, Donna, she said, and ended the call. She sat with her phone in her hand afterward. Alice asleep in the next room. The apartment quiet and warm. She thought about how much energy she had spent in the early months of all this, trying to understand what she had missed, what signs she had not seen, what she should have known sooner. She thought, I saw what was there. I was not blind. I was hopeful. That is not the same thing. Hopeful is not a failure. Hopeful is what love asks you to be. She had been hopeful, and then she had stopped. And both things, she thought, had been the right thing at the right time. The second thing, Meredith Slade had moved to a different city. Frank Holloway told her. Meredith had sent a brief note through his office. It said, I needed a fresh start. I hope you and your daughter are well. Clara wrote back the same day. She wrote, we are. I hope you find what you're looking for. Thank you for being honest when you didn't have to be. She sealed the envelope. She thought about what it meant to be honest when you did not have to be. When honesty cost you something. When it was easier and perhaps safer to simply disappear. Meredith had chosen the harder thing. Clara respected that. Quietly and privately, and without needing to say so to anyone. The third thing. Thomas Greer asked her to dinner. Not at the coffee shop, not over drawings, a proper dinner. He said it simply, directly, without elaborate preface. I'd like to take you to dinner. If you'd like that, she said. Yes, I'd like that. She said it without overthinking it, without the internal arithmetic of whether it was too soon or what it meant or what the right thing was. She simply knew, in the same clear way she had known months earlier, that something was wrong, the same quality of knowing. Except this time, it was not dread on the other side. It was something lighter. She called Becca afterward. I said yes to dinner, she said. Becca was quiet for 1 second, then she said, The architect? The architect. Clara. A pause. I think that's wonderful. I think so too, Clara said. I just need you to know, Becca said, that I have been waiting for you to say those words for approximately 4 months, and I have been very restrained about it. Clara laughed. I know, she said. Thank you for the restraint. It cost me, Becca said. It genuinely cost me. She took Alice to Connecticut in September to meet her great-grandmother. Margaret Whitfield was 83 years old. She lived alone in the house she had lived in for 60 years. The garden was still hers. She still tended it herself. She was small and sharp and had a way of looking at people that made them feel entirely known, as if she had read them quickly and accurately and was prepared to accept what she found. She held Alice for a long time. She did not say anything for several minutes. Then she looked at Clara. She's strong, Margaret said. Like her name, Clara said. Margaret smiled, a private, pleased smile. She looked back at Alice and said, Tell me about her. Tell me everything. So Clara told her, everything, from the beginning, the summer and the autumn and the long, slow winter, the receipt and the parking garage and the midnight nursery, the laugh, the hospital at 3 a.m, Becca's hand on hers, the roads dark and the contractions coming. The moment the voice filled the room, Margaret listened without interrupting. When Clara finished, the old woman was quiet for a moment. Then she said, You know what my mother told me when I was going through the hardest thing I ever went through? What? Clara said. She said, The only difference between a woman who survives and a woman who doesn't is that the woman who survives keeps getting up one more time, then she falls down. Margaret looked at her. You kept getting up? I did, Clara said. More than once. More than once, Clara agreed. Driving home through Connecticut that evening, Alice asleep in the car seat, the small sound of her breathing filling the car. The evening coming in through the windows, warm and green and unhurried. The trees along the road beginning, barely, to show the first suggestions of autumn. Clara drove and thought. She thought about the story she would tell Alice someday, when Alice was old enough to ask, when Alice came home with a hurt she didn't know how to carry, or a choice she didn't know how to make, or a person she wasn't sure she could trust. She would tell her the real version, not the version that had a clean villain and a clean victim, not the version where everyone behaved simply, the real version, where her mother was afraid and did the hard thing anyway, where a woman who was supposed to be the enemy turned out to be another person who had been deceived, where a quiet man in Connecticut made 2 phone calls and where a quiet woman in a hospital room held her daughter and was not afraid, where the worst year turned out to be the first year of the real life. She would say, He laughed. When I signed the papers, he laughed because he thought that was the end. He thought he had won. He didn't know. He didn't know me, but I know me. I know me very well now. She wrote the last entry of that year's journal on a Sunday evening in late September. Alice was asleep. The apartment was quiet. The south-facing windows held the last of the day's light, and the city moved through its Sunday evening outside, and Clara sat at the kitchen table with her pen. She wrote, He laughed when I signed the papers. He laughed because he thought that was it. He thought that was the score, the final number the thing that told him who had won. He didn't know my father's name. He didn't know my grandmother's name. He didn't know that I had been paying attention the whole time, from the very beginning. I had been paying attention and taking notes and learning and building something that had nothing to do with him. He laughed. And I walked out of that room and drove to an apartment and lay in the dark and breathed. And 4 days later, I drove through a storm in the middle of the night to a hospital. And I held my daughter, and I was not afraid. I want to say this clearly, for myself and for no one else. The hardest part was not the betrayal. The hardest part was not the anger, or the grief, or the long months of not knowing what came next. The hardest part was the time between knowing and admitting. The gap between what I knew and what I was willing to say out loud. I closed that gap. I will never let it open again. I used to believe that love meant accepting everything. I used to believe that patience meant silence, that grace meant swallowing what was hard, that being a good partner meant making yourself smaller so the other person could feel large. I know better now. Love means knowing what you will not accept. Grace means holding your dignity when someone is trying to take it from you. Patience means waiting for the right moment, not waiting forever. And starting over is not failure. Starting over is what happens when you finally choose yourself. Alice Margaret Whitfield. She is 3 months old, and she already pays attention. She already knows who is in the room. She will grow up in a home where she is seen, where she is heard, where the woman raising her is a whole person with a full life and an eye that sees things and the courage to say what she sees. She will know her great-grandmother's name and what it means. She will know her grandfather is a quiet man who makes phone calls when it matters. She will know her grandmother is a woman made of grace and steel in equal measure. She will know her Aunt Becca brought food and held the baby and never once said "I told you so," even though she absolutely could have. She will know that her mother was afraid and did it anyway. That is the story. That is all of it. Spring comes without warning. You don't plan for it. You don't earn it. It simply arrives. One morning, the light is different. The air carries something it didn't carry yesterday. The thing you have been surviving becomes, quietly and without announcement, the thing you are living. And you realize, the hard part is over. You made it, and everything, absolutely everything, is still ahead.
We have reached the end of Clara's story, but I want to stay here for a moment, because this story was never just about a cheating husband. It was never just about a powerful father making a phone call. It was never just about justice or revenge or a woman getting what she deserved in the end. It was about something much quieter than all of that. It was about the time between knowing and admitting. How many of us have lived in that gap, that space between what we already know, deep in our bodies, deep in that place that never lies to us, and what we are willing to say out loud? Clara lived there for months. She told herself she was being hormonal. She deleted the search history. She pretended to be asleep to avoid a conversation she wasn't ready for. She sat in a parking garage for 40 minutes because she could not go home. I think most of us know that parking garage. Maybe it was a different kind of situation. Maybe it wasn't a husband. Maybe it was a friendship that had gone wrong, a job that was making you sick, a relationship with yourself that needed to change. But most of us know what it feels like to already know something and to keep choosing, one more day, not to know it. Here is the first lesson Clara's story teaches us. Knowing is not the same as admitting, but admitting is where everything begins. The moment Clara said it out loud, "I am not imagining it, something is wrong," was not the moment she fell apart. It was the moment she started to come together. Saying the true thing out loud, even when your voice shakes, even when no one else is in the room, even when you whisper it to your own reflection at 4:30 in the morning. That is not weakness. That is the bravest thing you can do. Here is the second lesson. Quietness is not the same as unawareness. Clara was quiet for a long time. People around her, Derek included, mistook that quietness for passivity, for acceptance, for someone who did not notice. She noticed everything. She was simply patient. There is a kind of strength that looks, from the outside, like stillness, like endurance, like a woman who is simply absorbing whatever comes her way and asking for nothing. But inside that stillness, sometimes there is a woman who is paying very close attention, taking notes, understanding the full shape of what is happening before she responds. That is not weakness. That is precision. And precision, in the end, is far more powerful than rage. Here is the third lesson. Starting over is not failure. I want to say that again, slowly, because I know there are people listening right now who need to hear it. Starting over is not failure. Clara left the house she had painted. She left the kitchen where she had made coffee and believed she was happy. She left the version of herself who had needed to press her palm against wet paint just to feel that something was hers. And she built something new. A south-facing apartment with good light. A daughter named Alice who already paid attention. A friendship that had survived honesty. A career that reminded her what she was capable of. A neighbor who appeared with soup. A man who listened. A life. A real one. Built on a foundation that was true. Here is the fourth lesson, and this one is for the women who are in the middle of it right now. You are not required to collapse gracefully. You are not required to be quiet about your pain. You are not required to perform dignity while you are bleeding. You are not required to protect the feelings of the person who hurt you. But here is what I have seen again and again in the stories I tell. The women who come out of these things most fully, most themselves, are not the ones who fought the loudest. They are the ones who stayed in contact with who they were. Through the anger and the grief and the midnight reorganizing of things and the parking garages and the pretending to be asleep. They stayed connected to the person underneath it all, the one who knew things, the one who had always known things. Clara never lost that person. She just had to stop letting someone else convince her that person was wrong. And one last thing. To the women who are listening who have been laughed at, who have been underestimated, who have been told they are overreacting, imagining things, being too sensitive, making too much of nothing, who have sat across a table and been dismissed by someone who thought they already knew how the story ended. I want you to hear this. They do not know how your story ends. They do not know what you carry. They do not know what you are capable of. They do not know the name you were born with, the name you chose, or the name that lives in your bones. They do not know who answers when you call. Your story is not over. It is not even close to over. The hard part is behind you, and everything, absolutely everything, is still ahead. Thank you for being here today. Thank you for listening to the end. That matters more than you know. This content was manually researched, developed, and edited by our team, crafted with care to bring you stories that carry meaning, truth, and the kind of wisdom that only comes from paying close attention to what it means to be human. We do not create content for algorithms. We create it for you.